Jordan, first off, thank you for your time today, man. I'm honored to have you on the podcast. I want to set the stage for the listener a little bit and talk about the backstory of how you got into sports ownership. Was this something you always saw yourself doing, or did your interest kind of just evolve over time?
Yeah, I think a lot of it for me happened organically. Honestly, I had a lot of passion about sports in general, particularly soccer. And when I sold my company about 12 or 13 years ago, I wanted to get into the business of sport. I didn't necessarily know that would be at the ownership side. But what I really realized really quickly philosophically is that, everything culturally and organizationally starts at the top in sports. And so if you're not involved at the ownership level, it can be quite difficult to find the right projects. And so I was fortunate enough that I sold a company that I had strategic capital to allocate, and fortunate enough that I had built connections and some credibility in the soccer business space. And so kind of one thing led to another, and I started investing specifically in soccer, and that started with a very small stake in a Premier League club, and that was partly to get experience and partly because it was fun, it was exciting, and you get to sit in the owner's box when Chelsea comes to town, and that was fun. But from there, it's definitely evolved. I don't consider myself quote unquote like an investor. Definitely an operator. I've had a lot of experience, in a bunch of different roles, but I kind of used investment and ownership as a way to get into the industry rather than maybe what other folks would do is they take an entry level job in sports and kind of work their way up. I kind of came from a top down approach, which is unique. I haven't seen very many people do that. But it worked for me, and that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
Yeah, a lot of people think the concept of sports ownership is glamorous, and to your point, in some regards it can be, but I feel like a lot of misconceptions and things that the realities that people don't see. So what are those misconceptions that you think a lot of people have about sports ownership?
I mean, yeah, like there's a lot of risk obviously involved when you're putting capital at play. It's difficult to deal in ecosystems where a lot of folks, your customers, supporters, even your own employees don't believe sports should be a business. Maybe that's a little bit more so what I deal with in Europe, but you do get it in America. And I see Major League Baseball teams, people killing their owners because they're not spending as much money as the Dodgers and that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, when you're investing in something, you expect a form of return, and that return certainly most of the time is financial, but it can be other things. I think the challenge too is people, again, don't understand it's a business at the end of the day. And I would say 85% of my time in my various global sports projects is dealing with like HR and dealing with hiring and firing people and dealing with labor laws and tax laws. And, sure, the fun part is when we actually have games, but, we joke that like, you put the work in all week, and then when we have a match in soccer on the weekends, you're like, oh, that's right, we own a soccer team, because you forget about that because it's just a business at the end of the day. And so I think most people just think it's glamorous and fun, and maybe some owners do treat it like that if you have enough expendable income to just treat it like a vanity toy, right? Yes, sure, maybe it is fun and sexy, but in reality, there's a lot of pressures. It's a very incredibly forward-facing business in that if I own a manufacturing company and I decide to do something that people don't like, no one's going to care. No one cares about the manufacturing company. But if I fire a manager, if I make a poor mistake in recruitment, if I raise ticket prices, if I do things in sports, it's in the local papers, it's on social media. People are killing me when I go get coffee down the street. So it's an incredibly forward-facing and pressure-intense industry, and I think most folks don't necessarily understand that.
Yeah, and on that same note, what would you say has been the biggest lesson learned or takeaway from doing that first deal in the Premier League to now, which we'll get into the Kelty Hearts acquisition, which you
Yeah.
recently made? What would you say is like the biggest lesson you've learned over that time period of investing in sports teams?
I mean, look, I mean, for me, my space is global soccer, European football, and that's very different than North American sports. So I think my experience is very unique and different. But for me, I think obviously that space has become very, very popular, whether that's Wrexham, whether that's Ted Lasso, and it's become very sexy and trendy to own a European soccer team. And I think what I've learned very quickly is that these businesses are generally very poorly run, and it can be really challenging to come in not just to clean it up and bring better people in and make better decisions, but like the structures in place that we have in North America to control for costs, revenue sharing, salary caps, those things don't exist in Europe. And so trying to create a model that's financially sustainable in that environment, it can be really challenging. That number one, and then certainly for me on a personal level, you're running a business in a foreign country, right? And you're dealing with, like I said earlier, tax laws and labor laws and cultural differences. One of my more recent projects is we had a club in Denmark, and it's a lovely place. I love Denmark, but going to Denmark on vacation to Copenhagen for a week is very different than owning a business there and being there full time on and off for 4 years straight. Culturally, they look at the world very different from we do, and there's language differences, and so I think all of those challenges I've evolved and learned over the years how to navigate that, how to de-risk things, how to figure out how you can live in that ecosystem, certainly as an American in the best way possible. It's still challenging on a day-to-day basis. I've been doing this for a long time. I still get things thrown at me that surprise me. And I think a lot of that is the international component of sport that I sit in. So again, that's unique to me, but that's certainly what I would say.
A lot of what I'm hearing you saying is related to some of the, to your point, like cultural challenges and things that structurally are different in Europe as opposed to here in the US. So when you were initially looking at investing in sports, why did you take the approach of looking at Europe as opposed to domestically, given all the challenges and hurdles that you might be facing, in different countries?
Yeah, I think I saw, and I think it's still proven to this day that European sport is undervalued compared to North American sport. I think the valuation increases, you know, franchises, it's pricing out normal wealthy individuals in the United States from
Yeah.
investing in sport. I think 15, 20, 25 years ago, if you were a wealthy family office or even is institutional investors, you could buy a minor league baseball team, you could buy a professional soccer team, you could certainly buy anything in women's sports at that time, maybe at that time even get into the NHL or whatnot. All of those are completely off the table for the most part at this point. If you have 10, 15, $20 million you want to put into sports, there's nowhere to put it in American sports right now for the most part, unless you go to a really, really low level. In European football, you could get a pretty decent sized club in a very attractive location for those price points, and it has become very sexy. Obviously, the challenge is operationally, a lot of the clubs in Europe do burn quite a bit of capital, and it's understanding how do we institute structures in place to change the model so it doesn't indefinitely burn and we can create a sustainable business around it. But the barriers to entry in European football are incredibly low at this point. And so I think for me, what I saw 10, 15 years ago was that, you know, there was going to be a trend of more American and North American investment in European football. Clubs were undervalued. I was always interested on a personal level of cracking that nut in terms of the international component to it and how if you own a baseball team in the US, that's great. It's fun. But like owning a sports team in Europe or in Asia or in South America, it creates a whole set of challenges. And as an entrepreneur and my background's in building companies, like I always found that really fascinating and interesting. So it's kind of a combination of those factors. And certainly for me, I'm a soccer guy. And so if you're in the soccer world, you want to
Yeah.
be in Europe because that's where all the biggest and best teams are.
Yeah, 100%. And talk to me about the Kelty Hearts acquisition. What was attractive about that club, and give me kind of some of the details behind why you chose to pursue this opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved obviously at a lot of different levels, passive ownership, board level, chief executive, been doing consulting work the last couple of years, and I've looked at a lot of deals and been involved in a lot of deals that frankly just didn't make a lot of financial sense. That were just it was too difficult to find a model financially that worked. When I started to look at a couple clubs in Scotland and looked at clubs that were a little bit smaller, I realized like they're at a low enough level where the cost basis is quite low and they are, for the most part, financially sustainable. They're not burning tens of millions of pounds every year. And so I really like the kind of the financial model around this club. It's in a great location. It's 20 minutes from Edinburgh, 40 minutes from St. Andrews. There's whiskey distilleries, golf. Everyone loves Scotland. I love Scotland. My wife has Scottish heritage. So I think for a lot of different reasons, we saw a lot of upside. The club has had a great story. It's kind of had a mini Wrexham, I guess you could say. They got promoted 3 times up to the third division. So, it's a blank canvas, a club with a really limited risk and limited, downside from a financial perspective, a lot of upside in terms of enjoyment and location and football upside as well. And so I think it was all of those combinations that made it really attractive. I put a group together. There's about 25 of us of a bunch of different folks that are interested in the project. And it kind of was the right fit at the right time for us.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your point about at the end of the day, this is a business. So you
Yeah.
have to make money, you have to generate revenue. So how do you balance the commercial side of ownership with the cultural, the legacy? Because a lot of European clubs have rich heritage and history and the expectations of the community that come with the club. How do you find trying to strike a balance between those two things?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think a lot of folks struggle with that balance. I think you have to pick and choose the battles you fight. I think ticket pricing is one of them, where as Americans we think of like, okay, if there's more demand than supply, and we should maximize the revenue on ticket prices. But like here over in Europe, ticket pricing is a really sensitive issue, and any incremental growth you could get in revenue by maximizing ticket pricing, you're going to get killed socially because it's just not part of the culture to maximize revenue on ticket pricing. So we have to kind of stick to the lanes that we think there's a lot of room for growth. Like certainly sponsorship is one of the areas. There's certainly soccer specific revenue streams in terms of selling players. You get a club promoted, and that drastically increases your commercial revenue. But there's a lot of those areas, and then it's also about being creative. You have folks that buy clubs that have there's a real estate component to it, so you're getting whether you own your stadium or adjacent real estate. We're trying to get creative at Kelty, where we're thinking about can we create an apparel brand from a merchandise perspective? Can we build out a hospitality business to bring folks over to Scotland? Can we have a youth vertical where we're doing camps and whatnot? So there's limitations from the football soccer side itself. So it's figuring out how do you get creative to bring in additional revenue. And even if those businesses aren't necessarily directly related to the day-to-day of the club, how do you tangentially figure out ways to benefit the club? And I think you have to get creative, but there's certainly ways to do it.
Yeah, obviously, like the domestically here in the U.S., like it's a completely different infrastructure and ecosystem. But are there certain strategies or components of U.S. sports ownership that you can or that you're trying to implement over there, or using some of the tactics that may be used here and trying to implement them into Kelty Hearts and what you guys are trying to build?
Some things translate, some things don't. I think there is a somewhat disconnect between American sport and European sport when it comes to like why people go to the games. I think in America, and again, it depends, but people are really very interested in hospitality, match day experience, and top-notch facilities. In Europe, it's like, is the team winning? Are they going on a road promotion run? That's a big piece of it. So it's kind of parsing that out and saying, are there other things we can do besides just focusing on putting a good squad on the pitch to win games to get people to the matches? Um, like I said, I think you can get creative in some ways. We're starting to figure out like you have to understand your client base and why they want to come to the games. And so I think at some clubs it can be challenging and others it isn't. But like, yeah, I think like our merchandise offerings, I think many clubs in Europe really struggle, putting out really creative, forward-thinking apparel. Like we think we can do that from an American perspective. Again, like I said, are there other doing youth camps in the summer, like the club hasn't thought about that before. Are there ways that we can utilize our stadium for non-football revenue? Like I think a lot of those things from an American style, people don't necessarily think about in Europe, and there are opportunities. I'm not saying there's huge necessarily growth opportunities from a commercial perspective, but there are ways to get creative in terms of hospitality and whatnot. So like, yeah, there's definitely some synergies there.
How are you guys thinking about technological integration? Like obviously AI in sports is huge. Is like that top of mind as far as like data-driven decisions and implementing AI within the offering in some aspects? Like what's the strategy around that?
Yeah. Look, I mean, we have a bunch of folks in the ownership group that are really deep into the sports tech and the data analytics side. We have a couple of folks that do this for a day job. We have one guy in the group who works in the NBA data analytics. Our biggest challenge as a club of this size is like there isn't that much data at this club. At a certain level, this isn't a Premier League stadium where you have cameras everywhere and everyone's tracking every little piece of data. We don't have that. So it's starting to figure out with the data pieces that we have, how do we get more creative? And I think one of the things we're thinking is how do we create like kind of a sports tech ecosystem in and around the club in terms of bringing in, I'm based in Silicon Valley, San Francisco. We have a lot of investors in the VC sports tech world. So can we bring in companies that they can beta test their technologies at our club and with the players, and whether that's injury prevention or player performance or health and wellness or certainly recruitment, or is it off the pitch when it comes to, CRMs and point of sales? Like starting to think about ways we can implement technology from like a leveraging our assets. It's not a situation where we're going to be building out some sort of massive data analytics structure of finding players from Africa. That's not what this club is, and the club can never do that. But can we get smarter about implementing some pieces of technology that help the on pitch and the commercial side? We think we can do that, and that's probably through some sort of sports tech incubator ecosystem. It's going to take us some time to set that up, but we think the club can be a vehicle to bring some of those companies into the fold, and then maybe some of them we work with other Scottish clubs or other clubs in the UK to implement and bring those companies into the larger European football ecosystem.
Mhm. Yeah, obviously, these days we're hearing a lot about sports as an asset class. It's a term that's emerged over the past several years. What does that mean to you in practice, and where do you see the long-term tailwinds of this ecosystem going?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think in some ways, certainly in North America, I think you see it as an asset class in terms of the massive growth in valuations and uplift on valuations. I think you see like what Arctos has done. They're, buying minority stakes in clubs, and they just got sold at a huge, massive uplift. So I think in some ways it's a massive growth asset class, and media rights continue to grow. I think certain specific areas, whether it's women's sports or some growth sports, pickleball, whatever there's a lot of growth there. I think in on a global sense, the world I live in terms of European football, it's difficult necessarily to quantify it as an asset class because yes, franchise valuations are rising and some clubs necessarily are becoming more valuable, but a lot of clubs are still being run at significant losses and there isn't necessarily more of a focus on long-term growth. So the way I look at sports as an asset class is it just needs to be diversified. If you're gonna invest in sport and try to capture the long-term growth, it should be diversified across many different pieces of the industry, whether that's a bit in women's sports, maybe some in European football, some in North American sport. Maybe it's a small equity investment in the Arctoses of the world. Maybe it's some investments in high growth areas like I talked about. Maybe it's a lot of investment in youth sports, which obviously is a big growth area. So like to me, if I was raising a fund and I was putting together trying to really focus on the tailwinds in sport as an investment vehicle, I would probably figure out a way to diversify my investments across that whole ecosystem rather than throwing all my money in one space and kind of hoping that particular area is high growth.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. And as you mentioned, you put together a group of 25 investors to join the Kelty Hearts ownership group. When you're having conversations with maybe traditional investors who don't really understand the aspects or the nuances of sports, what's the hardest part to really convey or to convince people to come on board and kind of buy into, this mission of owning a club?
I mean, the hardest part for me specifically is the intricacies of European football versus other North American sports, right? To understand promotion and relegation and the system of developing and selling players. And I think the whole culture around European sport is so radically different than North American sport. It takes a lot of educating and helping people understand, like, there's no salary cap. Like, I've had that conversation with investors about the fact that there's no salary cap or revenue sharing and some of these other areas. Some folks I've talked to have a difficult time understanding how that works. That's probably the biggest difficulty I deal with in terms of convincing folks to be involved in these things is just them not understanding the differences between what they're used to in North America and what we deal with in Europe or abroad.
Yeah, and then going back to what you said regarding coming from the outside of sports, like you didn't, have a established presence in this space, like you came kind of top down. So, how is your background working outside of the industry help you approach ownership and differently from someone who maybe grew up in the sports industry and understand this from a different lens?
I think one of the challenges for folks that I know that have spent their whole careers in sports is that you get very siloed for the most part. You start as a ticket sales rep and you work your way up to a marketing rep or VP of tickets, VP of marketing, and then you're very much in one lane and you don't necessarily see the bigger picture. Now, at some point, if you get high enough when you're a chief executive or whatnot, you can start to see the bigger picture. But I think for someone like myself who's built companies before and been outside of sport, like I've hired and fired people, I've built companies, I've set P&Ls, I've looked at budgets, like I've done a lot of the things you do at small to medium sized businesses aren't necessarily different than what you would do at a sports organization. And so, like I said, a lot of my job on a day-to-day basis is HR and like not the sexiest stuff. If you come up through sports and you've just been a sales rep, like you're just going to know sales and you're not going to see the bigger picture. So I think that's the challenge. I think that doesn't limit people. Certainly, I know many folks who work their way up. I think the CEO of the Golden State Warriors here, who I know a little bit, I think he worked his way all the way up for 25 years through tickets and all the way up, and now he's the CEO. And like that just goes to show the dude's a super sharp guy. But like that's somewhat the exception and not the rule. So I think folks that come from outside of sport at times can have a bit of an advantage to be able to see the bigger picture, at least if you've been in the world of building and operating companies like I had. So it just depends. It's a case by case basis. Like I hadn't had any experience previously in running companies abroad, right? And that was a big learning curve for me as well. So there's a lot of areas that you kind of learn on the fly and you figure out what works and what doesn't work.
And then if an investor was asking you for one piece of advice, had no experience in sports ownership, specifically in Europe, but wanting to get into the game, what would you tell them about how to navigate this space, or what should they be spending their first year doing to really understand and be successful long term?
I think the two most important things are educating yourself about the particular part of the industry you want to go into and be involved in, and then dealing with credible people. There's so many brokers and middlemen and people that will sell the next person down the street, tell them how easy it is and how much money you can make. It blows my mind the amount of people in this industry, and I just obviously sit in global soccer, but it's the same in North American sport, who will tell prospective investors anything they want to hear about how easy this industry is. And so I think understanding, hey, I'm working with folks, whether that's advisors, whether that's consultants, whether that's whoever that is, who are extremely credible, who will tell me what the reality is of what I'm investing in, what my risk factors are, and give it to me straight, basically. And there's a lot of folks in this industry that won't do that. And so it disappoints me. I have a lot of conversations with folks that call me and say, hey, Jordan, I wish I'd called you 6 months ago because I bought a club or I'm involved in a sports investment and I've lost a bunch of money or it's really difficult and I was told X and it's Y. And that's difficult to hear and frustrating, obviously. But I think it's about just being smart and being diligent and associating yourself with the right credible individuals. That is my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah, and then to that point, how do you really go about doing that? Is that just like over time building, getting to know people better and just building, trying to build genuine connections? Like, do you have a process around how, like your vetting criteria and how to know who to do business with?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously a lot of it's word of mouth and trust between, hey, I know someone who's done this before and they've strongly vouched for this person. I think that's a piece of it. I think it's finding folks who've actually done things credibly in the industry, whether that's owned clubs, whether that's been executives at clubs, whether that's been investors themselves. I think it's dealing with credible institutions and whether that's law firms, whether that's accounting firms, folks that are extremely credible who wouldn't associate themselves with those folks. I think that's important. I think what I find for myself is a lot of people reach out to me is because they hear what I say on podcasts like this or read what I say, combined with the fact that I've done this for many, many years, and they say, "Hey, like what he says resonates with me, and I find what he says credible." I think that's also important. I'm not saying I have all the answers by any stretch, but that's why a lot of folks reach out to me, certainly. So, it's using your own intuition and understanding like, are these folks credible? What are their motivations, right? Like this is a second career for me. I do this because I enjoy it. I'm not necessarily, I'm not the kind of person that I need to say whatever I need to say to bring in the next client, even if I'm lying off my ass. Like there's a lot of folks in the industry that don't take that approach. And so it's really parsing through that and understanding what the motivations of people you work with are and, figuring out for yourself what works for you and what doesn't.
Jordan, has been great. Last couple of questions before we wrap up. When you look out, let's say 5 years from now, what does success look like for Kelty Hearts in the organization?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're aiming to be the best part-time club in Scotland, and that means certainly continued financial sustainability, growth, hoping for, execution on some of these metrics. I would love for us to be bringing loads of American kids over every summer to come to our camps and generate revenue and have a great apparel line here in the US for Kelty Hearts. Certainly for us on the pitch, we want to continue to rise through the pyramid. We'd like eventually to be in the Scottish Championship. And so I think, combined on-pitch success, commercial growth, and financial sustainability, we think is a realistic goal within the next couple of years.
And then looking out over the next decade, how do you see the overall landscape of sports ownership evolving, whether that's, more crowd-funded or fan-owned teams or whatever the case may be? Like, how do you see that this ecosystem growing and evolving? And then where do you want to be in that future?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to tell. It's such a dynamic space. I think we'll continue to see growth in some of the more, what I would call like kind of sense secondary, non-traditional areas. I think we'll continue to see a lot of growth in women's sports. I think we'll see a lot of growth in youth sports as well. When it comes to teams and leagues, I continue to see investors who are much more financially disciplined. So they're looking for clubs that are in sports investments that are much more financially sustainable. So rather than just hoping for infinite growth, they're looking for foundational businesses that actually make sense. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing a lot more interest in smaller clubs on the soccer side in Europe, like what we're doing, is that if you go down low enough, your cost basis is low, where you're like, okay, for limited risk, I can get a club that isn't really burning a whole lot of money and it checks a lot of boxes. It's no different than the club that my buddy's buying for 25 million pounds, but I'm not losing money and I'm not creating some sort of a huge risk factor for myself. So I think we'll continue to see, obviously demand for investment in sports is going to grow and continues to grow at a pretty high clip. It's just about where those areas are. And so I think it's more high growth, lower risk. I think that is the area I see a lot of interest probably in the coming years.
Jordan, appreciate your time. This has been incredible. Where can people learn more about you, but also Kelty Hearts?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter or X, whatever they're calling it now, Mr. Jordan Gardner. I'm on LinkedIn too, and you can reach out anytime. Always happy to chat. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it.
Thanks.